Dr. Steck received his BS in chemistry from Lawrence College and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He received his clinical training at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston and did postdoctoral work at the National Institutes of Health and Harvard Medical School before joining the faculty of the University of Chicago. He holds an honorary Doctor of Science degree from Lawrence University. His scientific work has focused on basic membrane biochemistry and cell biology and has been funded principally by the NIH, NSF, and American Cancer Society. He has served on a variety of national advisory boards, most recently Population Connection. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ted Steck.
Thank you, Alex. I should say, in addition to that lovely introduction, my real interest is in the environment, and you're lucky because I'm not going to talk about biochemistry today. I'm going to talk about the environment. But before I begin, since I am the last speaker in this institute, I'd like to thank Alex and Andy for their excellent organization and for the invitation, and I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking them for this great institute. So this is going to be somewhat different from the other talks. Number one, I may not make it through the hour. My cold is getting worse by the minute. Secondly, I don't have any visual presentations. And instead, I sort of want to make this discussion style, so I'm going to be calling on you. I feel you've sat there long enough, and you're also now well briefed on disasters, and so I can call on you to help me walk through this. I liked the invitation because I could connect the environmental crisis to disasters and to call the environmental crisis a special or a new kind of disaster. Let me just say what I mean by the environmental crisis. To spend a sentence on it, I would say, as you all probably suspect, there's good evidence that the human race has outgrown its habitat, not just our original habitat in Africa, but now the planet Earth. And some say we're an overshoot, and we have to figure out, well, what does that mean since we're all here and thriving in many ways. Another way to put it is to say that even while we're thriving, virtually every major natural system on Earth, other than the human enterprise, is in retreat because of us. And what are the implications of that? And so I want to briefly have you help me sketch out what is what's going on with the environment, and then think about, well, why is this happening? What are the root causes? And then spend the rest of the time talking about social responses, which is half of what this institute is about. So let's see. Let me ask you then, what do you think are the key issues or the problems that are now afflicting the environment as it pertains to the human condition? And I don't want you to raise your hands, just shout it out and we'll move right along. Sorry, population, overpopulation, too many people. Yeah, so I thought somebody might say that. So I'll just say a word on that. Certainly, one way to put it is there's 7.2 billion humans, and the numbers of our rival higher mammals number in the thousands or tens of thousands. Let's say 1,000 giant pandas, a couple thousand tigers left, chimps and gorillas, and many of our most charismatic megafauna that we love are orders of magnitude, 1 million times fewer, let's say, than we're in the billions, they're in the thousands, right? So we're thriving as far as population numbers go. The other thing I'll say is that the population explosion, which characterizes the 20th century, an unprecedented boom in human population, is now ending, right? So in the 21st century, we are gliding toward zero population growth. And the plateau may be, if you're an optimist, 8 billion, if you're a pessimist, maybe 11 billion, something in there, okay? And then, but there's no reason why there'll be a plateau. Population will then probably start declining. And the reason for that is great. It's not like the death rate is rising. We're not in a Malthusian situation. It's that the birth rate is falling. And the reason for that is the desire to have fewer children is now sweeping the world, from the developed countries to the less developed to the underdeveloped. People see the point to investing more in fewer children, and that's the way it's going to keep going. Even though many governments have a pronatal policy now, say, uh-oh, we have too many old folks, not enough kids. The labor force is now no longer a pyramid, but getting squeezed upwards, so that how are we going to support all of the emeriti like me? I think in spite of that pressure toward pronatal national policies, which most developed countries have now, individuals are choosing to have small families, and I don't think they're going to be coaxed to enlarge their families. So it's the opposite of, let's say, the China one-child policy. Okay, that's it for population. So what other problems come to mind? Overconsumption. Okay, what else? What about the natural world? What's happening? Louder? Ocean acidification. What else about the ocean? Okay, fishery collapse, that's right. Some say that in 50 years we won't be fishing the oceans, there'll be nothing left. I mean, not that there won't be any fish, but it won't be worth our while. And in fact, we're already moving toward aquaculture onshore or inland. So yes, what else about the oceans? Coral reefs, pardon? Food chain, ecosystem disruption, coral reefs declining. Rising oceans, okay. What else? Pardon? What about water? Okay, the already problems with water, but the implication that universal access to drinking water could be the next oil crisis, could be dangerous for people. Other problems? Right, forest loss, and the implication there is not only that we can't use the forest, but the ecosystems can't use the forest, and climate will be affected by forest diminution, and is not to mention erosion and other kinds of natural processes that would be affected. So, other problems? Fracking, okay, or energy, fossil fuel energy supply, and how to maintain our energy-based civilization in the face of problems with sources of energy. What about, okay, sprawl. That's low on my list, but maybe you live in the suburbs and it's high on your list. Pardon? What about soil? Soil loss, okay, erosion due to our intense farming practices, due to deforestation, urban sprawl affecting what once were, say in this area, what's were great farmlands and rich soil. Oh, right, spill over into the oceans, eutrophication, and so forth. Okay, so we don't have to, we could spend a few hours on that, but I think we now share a perspective that things are serious and they're all man-made directly or indirectly, we'll say. Okay, that's good. So, okay, now a tougher question. Why is this happening? And I want you to dig as deep as you can. What are the root causes for this, what I call an environmental crisis? Capitalist ideology. Okay, capitalism, right. So I'm going to whip that capitalism later on, but I'm going to say right now that, yes, the bad practice of capitalism is a problem, but the good practice of market economics could be the answer. So that's where we're going to head, because capitalism is here to stay. Now the question is, can we fool it into behaving? Okay. Okay, capitalism, what else? Okay, short time frame, bottom line sort of thing, annual report or monthly report thinking. Or just maybe we're made that way, although we are the most far-sighted of animals as far as we know. Most animals don't think far into the future, but we do, not that we act on it. Sorry, say it again. Okay, yes, well, we're the most intelligent of creatures, and yet we're confused, and we're fooling ourselves, we're fooling each other, And that's sort of willful, right? Maybe in the context of capitalism, we want to fool each other or we want to fool ourselves. That means denial or willful ignorance, or did somebody say ideology? I'll say ideology. What else? Okay, religion, or lack thereof, or the failure thereof. Lots of everybody, I mean, the world, every group in the world has religion, and yet religions don't seem to, maybe it's ignorance or maybe it's ideology, don't seem to be rising to this challenge for one reason, for different reasons, I would say. Overconsumption, right? The wheels, and maybe we'll try and link that to capitalism as we go along.
Policy.
What about it? Bad policy. What does that mean?
Well, like not signing laws and things like the Kyoto Agreement.
Okay, what lies behind that? Is that ignorance or ideology or politics, or is it enlightened self-interest? That it's not good to join the UN in trying to save the whales or whatever.
Unbridled individualism.
Okay, so that's right. So modernity is characterized by individualism coming from actually Judeo-Christian Islamic belief systems that say there's one God and God is in our lives looking after us, going to take care of us. Maybe that's why some people are accepting of the environmental crisis. It's God's will. But also that each of us matters, and therefore we sort of get to do our thing. And our culture is very much organized around an unstated principle of self-realization. That's why you're here, right? I hope you're here to improve yourselves, and maybe you had to drive here or fly here to do so. So here we are as individuals improving ourselves. What about human nature? It's in our genes. We just can't help it. Sort of biological imperative. The other animals just, follow out their blueprints. Is that what we're doing? No? Is it? How was it disproven? Okay, so right. Okay, so yeah, I like two things about that. One is it says that the situation we're in is new. The Industrial Revolution is critical, and we have to talk about why is that, and that it's sort of a human doing. It doesn't have to be, right? That's what you're implying, that in human nature is the capacity to live very differently with nature. Okay, yeah. People can't hear you because of all the kids out there. Yeah, this is going to be a tough job for Andy because maybe you should bunch together and he'll have an easier time with it.
Sorry, it wasn't that important, but I was just saying that we have no evidence if this has happened sometime in the past, I'm talking about far past, then we'd say, oh, well, it's obviously genes or, human nature or something like that, but it's a one-time deal. It's only happened, less, 150, 200, 300 years.
Well, okay, yes and no. I like what you said, but if you read Jared Diamond and you look at his book Collapse, am I doing this wrong? Okay. Jared Diamond would say that human societies have done themselves in over and over again, and that this is just number N on the list. But I think the idea of industrialization and modernity is close to my heart because it says something's different, and to me that's the power that comes with the Industrial Revolution, plus this thing about the self-empowerment of us as individuals, that we prize that very deeply. The whole world wants it. The reason people in poor countries that used to depend on having a large family now want to have a small family is, again, because of this emphasis on the individual, their children or themselves. So I think it will be discovered. You use the word proof. Well, as a scientist, we never talk about proof, but I think it will be found that there is a genetic predisposition toward self-interest and what we'll call selfish genes, okay? And that's because the genes themselves are selfish and want to propagate themselves, and we want the same thing. We're the vehicles of our genes to propagate them into the future. And so we have that very strong predisposition. It's not like ants, we're not automatons. We make choices, but there is that predisposition. There's also a predisposition, as was said earlier in the last day or so, toward altruism, and that we are the most social of animals, and that we also are the most guilty of animals, although your dog may show a lot of guilt at times, not as much as we do. And so we have all sorts of emotions that make us respect each other and honor the alpha males or the graybeards or whatever, and to work together and so forth. So we have these warring impulses or predispositions towards self-oriented behavior and group-oriented behavior. And if the group becomes the group of humanity, and our circle of family is extended not just to our distant cousins, but all the way around the globe, then at least we're one-worlders, and we can work together on these problems, not that that solves it. So I think there is, our genes do matter, but I agree with what you say. They don't bind us to any particular course of action. Maybe we've turned some of the genes loose to great an extent for a purpose. Okay, maybe that's enough about, let me see if I have any root causes that we missed here. No, I think that's fine. So I'll just say in that regard that this package that we're exercising works. It has made the human species, extraordinary. It has given us what has to be called just fabulous success. But we're in some ways then the victims of our success. It's not like we're suffering from want as much as maybe from having too much power through industrialization and not enough wisdom. So the wise men and women among us aren't constraining our power, and so we're sort of making miscalculations through ignorance or will or just inexperience. We've never been here before. There's one more thought I have before we start talking about capitalism, and that is something called the tragedy of the commons, and I don't know if that phrase has come up here, but it's a nice metaphor that was coined by Garrett Hardin some decades ago, and don't read his essay on this. He's an eco-fascist, and I don't like that essay at all, but the concept is very powerful. It is, well, some of you have read him, obviously. So tell me if I'm wrong. Basically, the idea is, tragedy of the commons is that we all are sort of innocent, and all we want is our little piece of the pie. We want to graze our sheep in a commons, just enough to get along. And the tragedy of the commons is, if we all do that, pretty soon the commons is gone. And so it's sort of a metaphor about open access property, and if nobody owns Mother Earth, then we all are taking our nibble, and if there's so many of us, pretty soon we've done a lot of damage in our own innocent way. So it's not like we're megalomaniacs, but even through whatever means it took to bring you here, whether it was a plane or a car or even a train, it impacted the Earth, and what can we do that doesn't impact the Earth? And so innocent activity adds up when you're 7 billion strong. Yeah.
Just to add one contributing cause, perhaps, it seems inequality is really important in thinking about these things, that the problems aren't equally distributed, and some people will bear the problems more than others, which perhaps allows those problems to continue.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's the issue of distribution, and whether I'm thinking, is that a root cause? Well, in many ways it's not. It's sort of an outcome that some people just do better than others, fairly or otherwise. But in a way, if that leads, let's say this maldistribution leads to discontent and war and so forth, then it can drag us all down. And in that sense, just that dark side of human affairs is a contributor to our own difficulties. And maybe we'll come back to that. It's a good point. Okay, other comments before I shift gears? Okay, so I want to give you an idea, a hypothesis, we call that in the lab, about why bad market economics or capitalism may be a central underlying problem for us in this modern age. By modern, I mean the last 200 years since Adam Smith, democracy and the Industrial Revolution. By Adam Smith, I mean modern capitalistic thought, all emerging at the same time 200 years ago out of the Enlightenment and the Reformation and the Renaissance and so forth. So we are empowered by that heritage intellectually and by putting it to use materially. Okay, so let me bash capitalism for a while. So I'll wander through capitalism very briefly for you. So the goal, let's say, of our economic activity is to improve our lot, and that's called economic growth. So growth is supposed to lead to more growth in an ever upward spiral of material well-being. And this has succeeded, as we all have to admit. We are really living well. And so, it's not wrong for the UN, let's say, to want as a universal goal that this sort of thing be extended to what people call the have-nots or the developing world, or however we want to phrase it. So this distribution question. So can't we be rich enough that all of us could share in the bounty that the Industrial Revolution and the market system and civil governments, democracy have given us. And in principle, what that means, basically, if we take the number of people in the world, or we take the gross world product of about 60, or let's say $70 trillion divided by the number of people, 7 billion people, you get about $10,000 per person if we were to distribute human cash evenly. So it's not an impossible idea that we really could share equally, although the logistics would be formidable. Won't happen. Okay, so this economic system of ours has been highly successful, and we should thank it, and we should want to extend it universally. There's another reason for economic growth that's a little darker and less obvious, and it is that as the machine age progresses, and especially the information age and the electronic age, where it becomes ever more important that where machines can replace people to do tasks, then people become unemployed in the process. And the whole idea of economic growth to many economists is the idea of staying ahead of that dilemma and creating new employment for college professors or high school and grade school teachers or whatever, just that we're no longer all 75% of us being agrarian because we had to feed ourselves. That's long gone. We have 2% of us being farmers, and the rest of us have to do something else to support ourselves. And so we have to keep driving the economy in order to stay employed, or else we just divide up the money and all take our $10,000 and that's it. So in that sense, you'll hear government officials talking about economic growth and employment sort of in the same breath. That the real problem is that, and the dark side of that is, well, if you don't do that and you have massive unemployment, then you have unrest, then you have revolt, you have revolution, you have unstable governments, whatever, and that's anathema to governments. So that's what's driving us forward. So when people say overconsumption, I don't look at it that way. I mean, yes, overconsumption for sure, but the question is, how do we have an economy that doesn't create wealth? We don't want that. Or doesn't have full employment? We don't want that. So what do we do to make it work? And the answer has been, as Dick Cheney told us, let's say after 9/11, consume. Go out there and buy and be normal Americans and so forth. So those are serious problems of worldwide economic organization that immediately feeds back to the finite and vulnerable planet that we live on. So that's where I'm headed here. Sorry. I'm going to ask you more questions in a second here. Yes, so in fact, the way so the key issue here with economic growth is actually wealth production, right? That's what it means. So where does wealth come from anyway? And I'll just say in a simple-minded way, there are two sources for us to think about here. One is the natural world, that we can extract minerals, fossil fuels, lumber, fish, whatever, from the natural world, and that is wealth. And you'd have to ask yourself, well, what would it cost me to make a fish? Well, it'd be pretty expensive, right? But here you have a fish there in the pond for free. So we'll get to the natural world as a free good in a minute, but that's the incorporation of the natural world into our wealth is extraordinarily fundamental. So how do we then spare the world if we want to get richer? So there's a problem. The other source of wealth is what we do with what we take from nature, which is to add value, right? We turn it into a microphone or a podium or an automobile, and it isn't just that we transform the raw materials, but we actually add value because we are smart. We make not just a car, but a great car, an airplane that flies faster and so forth. And so that added value is worth something, whether you patent it or create a company or whatever. So I'll say the dark side of that equation is that consuming the natural world or incorporating the wealth of the natural world into human hands creates environmental problems. But the human side of adding value through our brains and hands is salutary, and we have to do more of it. By the way, you can stop me for questions at any point. This is informal. Okay. Let me say one thing. I mentioned the word ideology. Someone mentioned capitalism. I'll say, for purposes of discussion, that the free market ideology, which lies behind the way we organize markets, and which is a universal goal for, let's say, 3/4 or more of the world's governments, that the free market ideology is a fantasy that is untrue. Unless you're a real ideologue, you can weigh the evidence. And I mean, I'm a lefty, so I'm biased, but you're not. So you could look into this and convince yourself that there is no such thing as a free market. So what's the alternative? Well, what does free market mean? It means a government free free market, yeah, a market or a economic system free of government. That's all. And so can you have an ungoverned market? Well, conservative economists say yes, and that's the best kind of economic system. But a moment's reflection convinces you that that's not possible. Even a poker game in the Wild West needed rules, right? And the rules, and somebody with a six-shooter to enforce the rules. And if you don't have a source of power behind it, mutually agreed on, hopefully, then things don't work so well. And in fact, there's then corruption and cheating and a degradation of good market systems. So I'm in favor of market systems, but not degraded systems. So I'm not interested then in the free markets. Then what my view is that the market is sort of a blind animal or a blind machine, very powerful, but doesn't know which way to go. It has to be steered, and good government is what steers it, and that's a success. If you look at the success of modern nations, that is how it works. Not that bad government is a good thing, obviously not. There can be market failures when a good market system doesn't fulfill its own goals, and there can be government failures when the government messes it up as well. Okay, but you can see why capitalists or free marketeers are anti-environmental, because the environment needs protection. Who's going to protect it? Well, we have NGOs, we have people of goodwill, but governments can protect it, and so they are an easy target for someone who believes that the market should be unfettered. Another problem that leads to environmental strain is the way we measure our economic growth or our prosperity. And let's just take the GDP as the focus here. So the gross national product or the gross domestic product is a measure of more or less of the tempo of the economy, how it's its pulse or its metabolic rate, how fast goods and services are being exchanged at any given time. And so the GDP of the American economy is something like $16 trillion a year, right at the moment, let's say. So what's wrong there? Well, it's a very valuable system of making that measurement, but it doesn't tell us what is being gained and what is being lost to have the machine running at that speed. And so what is being gained is that natural resources are being brought into the system, true value is being added by human activity, but lots is being lost because we don't subtract the forests and the oceans and the soil and so forth as losses from that measure. If there's an oil spill, like in the Gulf, all the activity to clean up the oil counted toward our GDP, and we became richer according to the GDP to that extent. But the damage that was done was not subtracted, and on, right? So the GDP is a very poor measure, in fact, of whether we're gaining or losing in this process of assimilating nature into human wealth. And we need other measures, and there are many economists working on those other measures, and if we have time later on, I can tell you what's going on in this country, in France, in China, and in other countries to have what's called a system of national accounts other than the GDP, which is a system of national accounts. Okay, so I'll say bad economics, bad market economics is unsustainable, and that's our problem, the problem I want to address here. Yeah. So let me tell you about two facets of the market economic theory that fail in our present situation and are fundamental to the environmental crisis. The first on this campus goes by the phrase, "There's no free lunch," okay, attributed to Milton Friedman. I'm not sure he would have agreed it was his to start with. What that means is nothing is free, okay, which makes sense, right? Somebody somewhere along the line has paid for it. Now, if you know of something that's really free, raise your hand. We might say, the air is free. Well, okay, I'll give you that. But the fish in the ocean, are they free? Well, maybe in our economic system, yes, they are. But that doesn't mean that wealth didn't go into creating them, and that doesn't mean that they should not have a monetary value. But we call Mother Nature a free good, basically, and all the elements therein. And so if you pay for wood, you're not paying Mother Nature for the tree, you're paying the lumberjack and so forth, or the lumber mill for the delivery, okay? So we're getting enormous amounts of wealth free, okay? And that would be fine if nature could keep it up, but as we agreed, nature's under stress and in decline. And so the idea of pricing nature at zero value might be a mistake. If there is no free lunch, why are we lunching on nature for nothing? So obviously we are, because it's paying off royally and not to have to worry about the cost of pulling a fish out of the ocean, but maybe that can't go on forever. Maybe it's unsustainable, as we'll discuss in a minute. So that's one problem. Yeah, I could ask you to enumerate all the free gifts, but they would be sort of the flip side of all the problems you mentioned, soil and oceans and forests and so forth. Okay, the other problem has to do with something that's called negative externalities, and I want to walk you through it. An externality is a cost or a benefit, but let's talk about costs, that's not included in a market price. So that's very abstract. So what do I mean? If you're wearing some gold jewelry or have gold in your teeth, you can say, well, what was the price of that gold? Well, at current rates, a short time ago it was $2,000 an ounce for gold, and now it's something like $1,300 an ounce. Okay, so to whom do you pay that money? Well, the person, let's say the retailer who pays the wholesaler, who pays the miner, who pays the mine workers, but who pays for the 100,000 pounds of ore that are displaced to get a pound of gold? And that ore is tossed about, in some far-off place where it doesn't have to be paid for. And who pays for the damage done by the cyanide and the mercury that go down the river, because in the process of refining the gold, one has to extract that metal, which is now a trace scarce precious metal, and has to be processed. So all that river downstream damage is paid for by the fish. Well, we don't worry about them, but by the fishermen who are harvesting it, or by the people themselves who live downstream. So all those costs, that cost stream, we can ignore because really we don't pay for it. So if you are buying gold as an investment or as a trinket, your expense is being subsidized by people that you know nothing about, and future generations, and the environment as a whole, okay? And so that cost to nature, or what's called a social cost to society or to environmental cost, is a negative externality because that cost is not in the price that you pay. So costs not in prices are externalities. Or if they're benefits, they could be a positive externality, and we'll talk about that also. But right here, we're talking about damage, so we're talking about negative. Any questions about that? Because that's pretty central. Okay, so I think, let's see, a way to sharpen our thinking about that. Let me ask you, you're Chicagoans for the most part, so you know that there were 2 coal-burning power plants on the southwest side here until recently, Fisk and Crawford. So was the emission of SO2 and soot and so forth from those power plants, would you call that a negative externality? Anybody think not? Yeah, it was, because the neighborhood was paying for it, while I got lower electric bills because the power plant could save money by not scrubbing their emissions, right, on my behalf. So I was happy, but the poor people in Little Village weren't so happy, right? So that's a negative externality. They're paying my bill. Bad economics, so a failure of the market in that sense. Okay, what about gold mines? I already did it, right? Negative externalities there. What about Minamata? Yes, same thing, right? Mercury being dumped by a factory on people who didn't know it was going on. Presumably the factory owners did. What about fracking? Yeah, hard to tell now, right? And then we get into this thing about costs and benefits, because as came up in Terry's presentation, well, people there want it. They actually want to get employment and improve the economic situation in their village, in their town, let's say. And yet, who knows what damage it's doing, or how much they're poisoning their water supply and so forth. So it gets complicated. Okay, then we heard a lot about nuclear power and nuclear weapons testing. So a negative externality, let's say, for those people out in our Southwest or elsewhere who were being exposed to radiation during atmospheric testing in the 50s without them knowing it, was that a negative externality? Well, in a sense, it wasn't a market good because it was the government, right? But in another sense, it was keeping our taxes down because the government didn't have to worry or take care of the radiation being emitted. They just saved us money by saying, well, those people out there, they'll tolerate it. You know, in the same sense that we've heard throughout the last day or two about the presumption that the locals would tolerate whatever it was that either industry or government wanted to impose on them without their knowledge. So all those, to me, are negative externalities. What about dams? We heard about, I guess, Kathy Morrison talked about dams which displaced 1 million people. So did those 1 million people get adequate compensation? She said not. I can believe that. So is that a negative externality to them? Did they have to pay as a social cost for the fact that other people would get cheaper electricity or better irrigation? Sure, negative externality. So I'm trying to make this go from your jewelry to the world as a whole here. So let me see. Oh yeah, the factory in Bangladesh, 1,100 deaths. The factory owner saving us money on our manufactured clothing. We were the beneficiaries. They paid the price. So any unfair labor, in a way, is a negative externality, a social cost, but it's the labor force that's paying for it. But isn't it the same deal, right? So that gets pretty big if we're talking about all labor that's being unfairly treated. Are being subjected to well, I'll say exploitation, in a sense that they don't know the true cost that they're incurring and who gets the true benefit, which is low prices in a world of competition, which is at the heart of a market economic system. So how do we have a market system that doesn't have competition? And if we have competition, then we have to have a race to the bottom, literally, to lower prices. And if we do that, then we have to have externalities, because if you don't, the next guy will. And so built into competition is the vulnerability toward negative externalities and social costs. And the problem with social costs is that it's not fair. It's not quid pro quo, in that the cost to people, let's say the people in Little Village who are being subjected to air pollution, is greater than the penny or two that I'm saving on my electric bill. So it's unfair. And of course the cards are stacked against them, because if we brought them in and negotiated it, they'd say, no, we don't think this is a fair deal. At least compensate us, but don't fool us. So in general, these negative externalities are inherently unfair or exploitative. You know, and speaking of which, what about, we heard a little bit about colonial rule with several speakers. So the whole system of slavery, colonization, and so forth, again, sort of negative externalities. The market price for what the Brits brought back to England was off the backs of the colonial subjects in a raw deal. In other words, it wasn't a zero-sum transaction. It wasn't a transaction at all, because the people who suffered the negative externalities weren't in on the deal and weren't compensated for it. Incidentally, we don't have time to talk about it, but our Fifth Amendment of the Constitution has a clause about takings, and takings are to protect us against just what I'm talking about, that the government cannot take from you without just compensation. And it can be, actually it did come up somewhere, where people can say, well, if you've zoned me out of, a certain beach property, so I can't create a bar and grill there, aren't you taking some of my income from me? And so we in this country have a constitutional base for arguing about what's fair compensation and how the market should work with respect to to private property. Anyhow, forget that. I was digressing. Okay, so then you might wonder, well, with all these this extraction from nature, putting in added value from human head and hand, negative externalities which are passing costs off onto those who don't benefit from it, are we gaining or losing? Well, it goes back a little bit to what Andy was asking. We could say many are gaining, many more are losing, so it's already a question of what's called environmental justice. And then beyond that, is it sustainable? Can we keep going on a system like this, or are we in fact doing ourselves in? And environmental economists are studying this issue, and in many cases they say, well, a country like the United States is still ahead of the curve. We're gaining more than we're losing by this environmentally questionable activity. But many countries, especially poor countries, are losing. They're cutting down their forests or ruining their soil in a desperate move to get on board the economic machine, but they're losing more than they're gaining. And that the data there are pretty weak and pretty early, but economists are getting more and more interested in finding out is what we're doing sustainable. Okay. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Consuming the materials from the earth, natural materials, is what makes us wealthy. But wouldn't, like, consuming these materials, don't they disturb the ecosystem? Like, it seems like it's only a few things that we should take from the planet, and a lot of things that are being taken from the planet are disrupting what is going on, and this is why we are having a lot of these disasters.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And the question is to find out, if we cut down a tree, are we gaining or losing? We may be gaining short-term, but not long-term, because we're not counting for the birds in the tree or the insects or the soil erosion and on, or the integrity of the forest. So that's just what environmental economists are wrestling with, how to find out sort of how to beat the system. Is there a way to progress sustainably? And by sustainable development, we mean economic growth in the present that doesn't impair future progress so that subsequent generations aren't paying our way, basically.
I wanted to ask about fracking and compensation. In the slideshow that the artist displayed for us yesterday, it didn't seem as if the folks that had their farm over here and now didn't have access to their valley over there. And do you happen to know anything about those specifically? Or I just wonder also, there was a question of who owned the mineral rights, and so...
Yeah, you raised that point, I think,
there's-
yesterday. That's a very good point. I'd like to know more about that also.
And then I'm also interested in, you mentioned that I think you were sort of teasing at the beginning that you think that the philosophy of capitalism is actually going to be what we need.
Yes,
Is that
good
still-
market
is
economics.
Good market economics.
Okay, and that's where I'm headed.
All right, I'm
Okay.
ready.
Okay, me too. Okay, go ahead, and then we'll get to good market economics.
Yeah, I guess this may be moving too fast, but I was wondering if you think the Constitution is kind of like lacking. I mean, you talked about the Fifth Amendment, but like lacking in this new market economics, just thinking about where our Constitution came from.
Yes. Yeah, I want to comment on that in general. I'll say this, generalizing that enormously, that neither our biological heritage nor our cultural heritage, meaning government, philosophy, religion, the Enlightenment, so forth, none of that has prepared us for the revolution that we face, the environmental crisis. We can't rely on our impulses, on our genes, on our predispositions, our emotions. We can't rely on scriptures. I don't think we can rely on the Constitution, because we're now in a situation that's unprecedented in human history. And in fact, centuries from now, people will look back at the beginning of the 21st century and say, yes, that was the turning point, for better or worse, that we don't know. They'll say, yes, they began to come to grips with the fact that the system that was so powerful and so beneficial for a few hundred years, this modern era that we've lived in, is not sustainable, that we have now recognized that. And so we have to sort of reinvent ourselves, and that's sort of where I'm headed here. What are the tools to do it? And I'm not terribly conservative, but I think the more existing tools, the more of our heritage that we can bank on, including our emotions and our hardwiring, altruism and so forth, but the institutions like the market, the better off we'll be, because otherwise we're Karl Marx or something, and you know what happened to them. So, okay, let's proceed then. Yes, so we're going to think about sustainable development as the way forward. We're going to be able to continue to create wealth, not for us, but on behalf of the many who deserve to live the way we do, and not shortchange the future. Tall order, right? I believe it's possible. If sustainable development does not pay for itself and, in fact, turn a profit, it's not going to happen. And what will happen instead, I don't know. So it has to, in my opinion. Okay, so the goal then, let's think outside the box. The goal for the 21st century is not economic growth, but environmental preservation. Not that economic growth is not important. In fact, it should continue, as I said. But if we don't have preservation of the environment, then we're going to end up like a moon colony, right? We will have a constructed world devoid of natural systems. And if you want to live in a moon colony, okay. But I think, and the reason I use that metaphor is because economists say as long as we are better off, we live longer, we eat better, more calories per day, whatever, more protein per day, than we were before the transaction, then do it, even though we're swapping, forests for nicer homes or something. And they say, but we're better off. There's increasing utility, even though we're paying the price, no free lunch. So that's called weak sustainability, in fact. I believe in the opposite. It's called strong sustainability. It's preservation. And then the point is not to keep this trade-off going, but to say, okay, we're going to be preservationists and then reshape the economy around that. Because if we don't, then eventually we're on an unsustainable path. So now we're thinking about how do we preserve nature and still create wealth, continue to create wealth, right? Okay, so we have to create wealth then without negative externalities, as we've just discussed it, right? So let me point out to you that there's only two things we can do with our wealth, that you can do with your wealth in general. One of them is spend it, you know how to do that, and the other is invest it, and you know how to do that. You can also give it to your sister, but she'll either spend it or invest it, or you can put it under the mattress and later on you'll either spend it or invest it. So simple, two things. So someone mentioned consumption. Let's just say maybe we're spending too much and not investing enough. And I think that's true because investment is the engine of growth, right? Because you create the means for even more wealth creation and more spending and more investment and so forth. So we want to be investing, and in the sustainable frame, we want to be investing in Mother Nature, in preservation, right? Okay, and ways to do that. Okay. Yeah, so I'm not against consumption, but I'm in favor of investment. You know, it's interesting. Countries like China, the Asian tigers, and all these, not the Tamil tigers, but the Pacific Rim go-go nations of the 90s, were saving at rates of, some of you are experts in this, 20, 30%. Okay, and China was a poor country saving at the rate of 30%, buying our bonds, right? While we were maxing out our credit cards and going into negative growth because of our borrowing. So it is quite possible to save splendidly, and whether you're rich or poor, let's say. Okay, so then the environment, to go back to economics, is treated as an economic, a productive asset. Okay, as capital, basically. It's a way of creating wealth, of having wealth. But we don't, like if you have an investment, you don't want to cash in your investment. You want to live off the interest or the dividends or the profit from it, right? So we want a capital stock, which is nature preserved, and live off of what are called natural services. Natural services are clean water, so we don't have to clean it, clean air, because we don't want to live as they do in Chinese cities that are toxically polluted, beauty, food, nature, the whole works. So we want to treat nature as a capital stock and live off of its services. Now you'll say, well, but nature can't do everything for us, so how do we live our lives? And so the answer is that we invest in people as a very low impact, sustainable resource. Human capital, people have used that term. Social capital, people use that term. I'll say institutional capital, to go back to a question that was asked. Institutional capital would mean better values, religion chiming in and giving us the word as to how to live, better economics, better science, better ways of organizing our society, better governments and so forth, all very low impact on nature. And that's where really where the deficit is, that we don't know how to organize ourselves to live sustainably. But it's quite possible. You know, we've left the cave and we've left feudal life and we're no longer mercantile economies and now we're market economy, but we can get even beyond that and become a sustainable economy. So it's all quite possible. I'm not saying easy, I'm saying conceivable. Okay. So what kind of human capital? Well, we invest in health, education, and welfare. Some elderly individuals here may remember we used to have a department called HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, but the word welfare didn't sound good politically, so they changed it to HHS, Health and Human Services. But that's the idea, invest in our own well-being and in education, that's where you guys come in, as a way of creating inexpensive, low-impact capital, wealth-creating ability. So we don't need to turn to nature for that. So that's where our future lies, and that's where education should be directed. I'll just tell you, I don't think you can argue with this. I'd like to see K through 12 education have an environmental component at every grade level, starting with whatever you do in kindergarten all the way up. And I think, and then, you know, as we say, the kids will educate the parents and so on. Seems to me obvious, but maybe I don't know anything about education. Maybe. Then there are values that we have but don't practice enough, like maturity. We're a very immature society. So we, you might agree, are a a frontier, sorry, I don't know that kind of, a frontier society, right? We, because that's, you know, how the U.S. was settled. And there's nothing wrong with that when the U.S. was more or less barren and the Europeans came over and so forth. And it seemed like there was an infinite frontier. The problem is we've taught that value system to the whole world, and in a closed, crowded world, a frontier mentality is unsustainable and destructive. So that will have to change. So instead, we have to have things like prudence and maturity, sufficiency, long-term view, read Henry David Thoreau, and so forth. Employment. So I said one of the reasons for economic growth, for the economic growth machine, was to soak up people who are being laid off by our continual improvement of our technology and machine power. And so the answer to that is environmental jobs, right? It's a little bit like President Obama wanting to invest national or borrow money to invest in infrastructure development. Well, infrastructure to me is the natural world, along with roads and bridges and so forth. So we all, in the future, since we won't have to work hard in factories and maybe even in universities, because it'll all be on the web, we'll be out there taking care of nature. And we've got a lot of trees to plant and a lot of cleaning up to do. And that, to me, is the only kind of sustainable employment that interests me. I'll just say in passing that there's a wonderful exploding field in scholarship on happiness. What constitutes it? Where does it come from? How do you measure it? And so forth. Enormous amount of activity on this campus. In any case, there was a report that Jeffrey Sachs authored just recently that said that analyzed happiness around the world, sort of country by country, and said that it comes less from excessive wealth after you get to maybe that $10,000 a year level, below which you're struggling and your wealth or lack of wealth is making you unhappy. But beyond that, people don't get happier. Okay, there's a plateau. And instead, what makes people happy is their health, their job security, their social status, their family, relations with their family and friends, political freedom, and a perception of lack of corruption or fair governance of them. And so, totally different way of looking at things beyond, you know, what Thorsten Veblen here talked about, conspicuous consumption and keeping up with the Joneses and all that. Okay, so I'll stop in a couple minutes, I guess. Let's see. So we need a 100-year plan. That's the plan for the 21st century. That's the life that many of you are going to participate in. We'll call upon the positive emotions that we have, social emotions that will be constructive. We will need to pull together, and I'll just remind you about that. There aren't too many good models for that, but the one that keeps coming to my mind is what happened during World War II in this country, but even more so in Great Britain when they were under attack. But when we had to mobilize, and not everybody pulled together, there were delinquents who were gaming the system, but basically as a society, as a country, we pulled together to face a common enemy, and people scrimped and saved and sacrificed and did so willingly if it was fair and square, and came out the better for it, came out feeling better about themselves. And in Great Britain, they say the Brits were depressed after the war ended, not because it was such a horrendous war, but that spirit of commonality and purpose suddenly disappeared. You know, the war is over. So luckily, this war, the environmental crisis will never end, okay? It's a permanent fixture. Why is this a different kind of disaster? I never got to that. It's global, it's permanent, and it's demanding of the kind of sacrifice, or at least response, that we're not used to making. So that's why this is a different kind of disaster. We're going to use market mechanisms, which means incentives, subsidies, and taxes, and adjusting the so-called free market to serve our sustainability goals. We're going to internalize true costs. So let me say a word about that. That means you're thinking, boy, if we internalize the cost of mining the gold, gold prices would double or triple. Well, so would the cost of beef, right? So you'd be paying $20 for a hamburger if you had to internalize all the costs of growing that beef. The water, the soil loss, the doctor bills. Well, you see, now that's a plus when the doctor treats your heart attack, but in the future that'll be a downside. So yes, so we'll have $20 hamburgers, and you'll have one. It'll be your birthday burger or your Christmas burger. Okay, twice a year. It'll be like caviar. You don't expect caviar every day, so you won't expect beef every day, because cattle consume 70% of our corn and are a major source of impact in this country and in South America and Southeast Asia of environmental impact. Do we need beef? No. Can we be vegetarians? Well, that's been proved to be a healthy diet, healthier diet. So okay, so a lot's going to have to change. We can tax beef then. We can tax emissions, whether they're greenhouse gas emissions. We already developed a system of cap and trade for sulfur dioxide emissions coming from coal-burning power plants that has reduced those emissions, which cause heart attacks and pulmonary disease. We've cut those emissions in half, virtually with no cost, just by creating a system of cap and trade. And if you don't know what that is, we can talk about it later. So taxes, cap and trade, subsidies. I'll end with a thought, maybe we'll talk about it in discussion, that we can reduce the federal income tax by $1 trillion a year. How do we do that? By assigning $1 trillion worth of taxes or caps to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so carbon dioxide emissions, let's say. So we're taxing, you've all heard about it, taxing gasoline and coal and gas, all sources of greenhouse gas we tax, just to the point where we can bring in $1 trillion that we then relieve of our federal tax. So it's revenue neutral. We're not gaining, the government isn't gaining any money or losing, and we'll just use that money for the purposes it now uses taxes. But the difference would be that the whole economy would change, right? Because if your gasoline, if gasoline then went to $10 a gallon, as it does in Japan and Europe anyway, people would be thinking more about hybrids, about taking the bus, about buying a bike, walking, all those good things. It would shift the economy just by something that's not costing anybody except the fossil fuel industry any money, right? So that's just a matter of policy. In fact, George W. Bush, to praise a capitalist, was very much in favor of a consumption tax, and that the Republicans still are favoring it, and the Democrats not, right? Because it sounds consumption tax would be regressive, it would punish the poor. That doesn't have to be the case. But they could see the point to lowering income tax, because they don't want to tax a valuable activity, which is make profitable employment and making money, and then why discourage that by taxing it? Let's tax something we don't need, which is consumption. Okay, so to conclude, I'll say that environmental economics, sustainability economics, will work the same way that standard economics now works, except we're going to get rid of negative externalities. We're going to assign a price to nature, so nature won't be a free good. You'll have to pay for the fish in the sea and the forest that you cut down and so forth. We're going to reallocate wealth, hopefully through things like health, education, and welfare, Obamacare, and so forth. So more people will be healthy and capable, therefore more productive, therefore a better generator of wealth than harvesting wealth from nature. So what's novel about what I'm saying is that environmental preservation will be the goal and will actually be essential because, in fact, to me, there is no alternative. If you think this is ridiculous, and maybe it is, and this is just my musings, you could ask yourself, we've had about 40 years of environmental laws now, really starting with Richard Nixon, who was not a great environmentalist, but with the Endangered Species Act and many other federal laws protecting the environment. In this period of 40 plus years, has the economy suffered? Have we suffered? Has there been any downside except for special interests which may have suffered? The answer is no. Has international treaties to save the whale or other Endangered Species Act, any of this really caused any damage to the economy? Absolutely not. So the answer is, let's just get going, do more. So thank you.
All right, already one question.
Thank you so much for giving us something exciting and fun to look forward to. And absolutely. And I just wanted to recommend Susan Daly's, I think, book, Nature's Services, which would be a very accessible way to study nature's services. Yeah, she's very readable.
Great, thank you. I'll write that down.
Obviously a very complex topic.
Right.
Mine's kind of two-part, my question, and just looking for more elaboration on it. You talk about the cap and trade, and I look at the fact that, yes, in theory it's a good idea, but it will also, wouldn't it also create a snowball effect where, okay, we're taxing these companies to pollute, and in turn, they're paying more, obviously, but they're going to try and take another shortcut to make up that money loss, as well as didn't they once try in the early 80s to tax pollution per se and then throw that in a big super fund? And that tax has kind of been erased as well.
Okay, so Superfund was different, and that was, I don't want to talk about that. It's not, we could talk about it later. It's not the same. As far as cap and trade, let me tell you, not only does the EU practice cap and trade, and it's true, right? Sad to say they're not doing well economically right now, but it's not because of the cap and trade. And in fact, California and several New England states are also voluntarily bringing cap and trade regimes into play right now, okay? I think California, in fact, has instituted a cap and trade system as of last year or this year. So many governments, not insane governments, are doing it. Well, it's true, the word complicated, I think, understates it. So with the EU, they made the mistake of giving away, maybe I should explain what cap and trade is. So let me explain, in a very successful system, that our sulfur dioxide emissions from our coal-burning power plants have been curtailed by about more than 50% in the last decade or so by a cap and trade system. And basically, the government and industry said this was great. Everybody signed great. Win-win-win situation. What they did, the government said, if you want to emit sulfur dioxide, which is a waste product of burning soft coal, you need a permit. One permit lets you emit a ton of sulfur dioxide, okay? And to get the thing going, the government gave the power plants permits initially, and then said, we're not going to give them away in the future, we'll sell them, so there will be a market price for pollution, okay? And then it said, if you have a permit, you can use it, and so you can emit your pollution, but if you can figure out a way not to emit the pollution, then you can sell your permit for a profit, okay? So in fact, in the city of Chicago, the Board of Trade is where the national center for buying and for trading these pollution permits operates. And so what people did was they said, well, I don't have to emit all the sulfur dioxide. I can sell my permit and I'll burn hard coal instead of soft coal because it burns clean. Or I can burn natural gas. And the whole coal industry is moving, as you know, or the electric power industry is moving away from coal and toward natural gas because it's cleaner fuel. So that conversion, they say, well, it'll cost us some money, but in the long term, we're going to be making a profit by switching away from coal. The public health encumbrance, the reason the government did it is even President Reagan's estimate was we're costing ourselves $100 billion in health care costs per year by breathing the emissions from coal-burning power plants, whereas it would cost us $10 billion a year to eliminate the pollution from the emissions by scrubbers, by switching to a cleaner kind of coal, or switching to gas, or just improvements. So that system has has benefited the U.S. enormously as far as health, and it hasn't hurt the power plant industry at all. It has hurt the soft coal industry, because who wants to burn soft coal and pollute the world? So you're right, these are early days in all these things. These are global experiments, but the big global experiment is global warming. So these little experiments, I think we can work out. So cap and trade is happening.
So, you started with a very global problem, and as you went to the solutions, I feel you've used specifically more Western or specifically American examples. Can you talk a little bit more, even with this question of coal, but take it from California or New England to India, let's say. Is this a global market for those emissions, or is this a local solution?
Yeah, so greenhouse gases and global warming is a global problem. So and that is a sticking point. And as you know, we've had the Kyoto Treaty, and it was an experiment, a step forward. We now have to go into phase 2 of Kyoto. It has to involve, 150 countries. It has to involve the developed countries have pledged $100 billion to help the developing countries get on board. So this is an international effort. And frankly, it's not going terribly well. But the fact that we're having regular the nations are meeting regularly under the UN to try and find a path toward greenhouse gas emission mitigation is a sign that everybody understands this. There was an article in the New York Times this week about a scientific study done in China, actually by a former member of the econ department here, where it was shown that the Chinese, or the citizens in northern China, have a mortality 5 years, or die 5 years sooner than their counterparts in southern China, due to the pollution, industrial pollution, basically burning a lot of coal. And it's not just that the old timers are kicking off earlier. The mortality was sort of spread all over because the particulates and so forth cause lung disease and affect everybody. China and India have to ask themselves, if you have a city like Beijing, how much is it costing you to save money on air pollution mitigation? And so cost-benefit analysis and good economics comes in there too. And where it's been studied, as I just said with the sulfur dioxide, it's calculated that we will save $100 billion in health impact by spending $10 billion on remediation. So I think other countries, China is desperate to do this, and I wish I had more time to talk about it. We could talk about it later. But they're trying to correct what would be their GDP system of accounts and get a system of national accounts that includes health and welfare as well as economic activity. And France is trying to do the same thing. And Clinton started this, Bush canceled it. We're now working our way back to it, have an alternative system of accounts. And so any nation would want to do this.
Oh, thanks. I have a question about inputs versus outputs being taxed and subsidized by the government, and I'm gonna botch this, but kind of the way that a few governments have taxed health outcomes or subsidized health outcomes. So if your waist circumference is above a certain measurement or whatever, and like these things that are like somewhat in our control but somewhat out of our control, like how can we tax and subsidize, I guess, like the right things?
Yeah, I think Kathy Morrison said she wasn't a policy person. Well, she's much more of a policy person than I. So I can't tell you. I think that sounds, yes. Well, I can put a positive spin on that. People don't like, especially Americans, command and control, it's called, or Big Brother, or the government telling you what to do. That goes against us. And in general, you know, we can understand we're for liberty and freedom, and I'm against the government telling me what to do. And so this whole the whole idea of using market incentives rather than command and control laws that say if you weigh so much, then you're going to get fined. The government's very keen on that, and that's where a lot of this thing like cap and trade have come in. I'll give you a good example to dodge the question, I guess. So it's not about waistlines. Some of you must have experienced bottle deposits or can deposits. You're all Chicagoans, or some of you know about it, right? So when you buy your pop, you pay a nickel a bottle or a can, and then you get it back because it was a deposit at the end. So this is a government regulation. It's true in Michigan and Wisconsin and so forth. So what's the point to it? Well, you obviously, what that system does is turn waste into value, right? You no longer throw away the can because it's garbage. You hang on to it, or you give it to your little sister, and then she goes and gets the nickel back, and that's called creating a little trading system, right? A little mini economic system to maximize your yield. You're lazy, you don't want to go back to the store, but your sister does. So there are all sorts of economic or incentive-based systems. Some are carrots, some are sticks. It's like the $20 hamburger. Nobody should be denied the right to eat a hamburger, right? I'm all for that. But similarly, I believe if we're going to embed the true cost of growing the beef in the price of the hamburger, maybe it's $20, and then you decide. It'd be like caviar. Does that help? Yeah.
Does the incredibly lopsided distribution of wealth, is that affected by this at all? I mean, just the whole idea that, well, in this country, what is it, 98% of the wealth is controlled by 1%? Because it just seems that until that's addressed also, that we're limited.
I'll say no. But we could spend hours talking about it. I'm not happy about either. But the environmental problem is big enough. I don't want to also tackle the problem of wealth distribution at the same time. In other words, I think we could save the environment and still have rather skewed wealth distribution.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so let us thank Dr. Steck.